250 volts. Answer horse.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Opinion Sustained. Today I wanted to talk about the unique aspect that differentiates humans from animals. The ability to take in input, analyze it so thoroughly to make decisions that could be considered much higher to that of an animal's decision making. Decisions like what could hurt a fellow man, who is the enemy, whether the enemy is another fellow human or another organism, and having the ability to evolve this thought process in such an exponential manner that it allowed us to be on the top of the food chain without having the powerful physical strength of a gorilla nor the speed of a cheetah. Yet we encage them and control them for our own safety. Yet with this uncanny ability of analysis and decision making, we do succumb to obedience when in a social setting. The term obedience is a form of social influence in which a person yields to explicit instructions or orders given by an authority figure. This is very similar to that of a child listening and following orders from their parents. And from this example alone, we can tell that obedience, whilst not really admitted by others, is taught early on in life. While obedience might sound normal to some people, it can be exploited by others, and this exploitation can be a terrifying flaw in the human mental, as sometimes it overrides the human's personal consciousness, forcing it to create atrocities or crimes against its fellow man. Many examples of this flaw being exploited throughout history. The best example is when Stanley Milgram examined the justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at World War II. These victims or accomplices, however way you want to choose to see them, kept their defense the same, being obedience. They were just following orders. So, Milgram set a hypothesis. Could it be that the Ishman and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we even call them accomplices? In order for Stanley to test this hypothesis, the Milgram experiment took place. The aim of the experiment was to test how easily a normal person could be influenced into making crimes and atrocities against another fellow man. The procedure was simply Milgram advertising an experiment on the local news about a test in learning. The participants were 40 males, ages between 20 and 50 years, with jobs ranging from unskilled to professional. Their payment at the time was $4 just for turning up. None of the participants knew each other. The experiment started by introducing them to another participant. They were asked to draw straws to determine their roles, either a teacher or a learner.
Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Will you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. Teacher.
Then they were introduced to a set of two rooms. One was for the learner. It had an electric chair, and the other one was close by. It had two chairs, one for the teacher and the other one was for the experimenter. The learner was given a set of word pairs. He was asked to memorize them as he will be tested by the teacher in them later on. Then the learner was trapped and left behind in the first room with a microphone to relay the answers to the teacher later on. The teacher then was taken to the second room, where he was introduced to another device, one connected to the electric chair that the learner in the first room was sitting on. This device had a shock meter on it. ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts. The experimenter then asked the teacher to question the learner, and if he answers incorrectly, he has to shock the learner and consistently increase the shock voltage each time he makes a mistake, with the maximum voltage being 450 volts. Now, in order for us to keep going, it is important to understand that voltage itself doesn't kill a person, but the current does. Voltage is known as current times resistance, and the human body has different resistances throughout the body. However, it has been reported that some people have died from volts as low as 42 volts. Time is also important. The increased exposure to the voltage does break down the body's natural resistance, and if the human survives the duration, usually they will be afflicted with burning hazards due to the breaking down of human tissue, specifically the skin. If the skin breaks down, current can run throughout the body. If it reaches the heart, with the heart being the most vital organ and having it very susceptible to any electrical disturbances, it can easily tip the balance of the rhythm of the heartbeats. This will be fatal for the person. Now that that's being mentioned, let us move back to the experiment. While the experiment had 3 people in it, the learner, the experimenter, and the teacher, only the teacher was being tested. Both the experimenter and the learner were confederates. The learner would deliberately give wrong answers to the teacher to invoke an electrical shock. And the learner is actually safe because the responses of pain with every voltage were recorded and not given in real time. Stanley knew that some candidates would protest against the continuation of the experiment when they hear the recorded messages from the learner. So he formulated a set of orders or prods to the teacher every time they refused to keep going. The prods were: 1. Please continue. Second one being, the experiment requires you to continue. The third one, it is absolutely essential that you continue. The fourth one, you have no other choice but to continue. I have to mention this, but in the research papers, Stanley Milgram does mention that before any subjects were tested, they were actually told that at any point in time they can leave and they were not held in there against their wills. But this prod was very important as it forced the authoritarian figure of the experimenter onto the teacher. That's where the real test is. Now let's move on to the results of the experiment, and they were 65% or 2/3 of the participants continued to the highest level, being 450 volts. All the participants went up to 300 volts. In conclusion, 2/3 of the participants went on to effectively administer a lethal dose of voltage just because a superior figure ordered them to. Even when the screams of the learner, who was introduced as another participant to them right before the experiment, and they knew that they were just lucky enough to be the teacher and not the learner, they still went on. Even when the screams of the learner ringed in their ears, they still went on to 300 volts. The concept was simple, yet extremely dangerous. The fact that these people who are innocent would just think that they hold no responsibility because an authoritarian figure was in the room and was ordering them did force them to commit crimes onto another fellow innocent citizens such as themselves. Now let's talk about the aftermath. After the Milgram experiment was done in 1963, Milgram understood the dire need of finding answers of such a flaw in the human psyche, and further testing was necessary to understand and explain such a phenomena. In 1974, about 10 years after the first experiment, Milgram repeated those experiments with different variations, from increasing the number of teachers into the room to moving the authority figure farther away from the teacher. He figured a few important details. The behavior of the participants were summed up into two states of behaviors. One was the autonomous state. This state, people would direct their own actions and they would automatically take responsibility for the results of those actions. 2. An agentic state. People allow others to direct their actions and then pass the responsibility of the consequences to the person giving the orders. In other words, they were acting as agents for another person's will. Also, in order for a person to be in an agentic state, two things must be present. 1. The person giving the orders is perceived to be qualified to direct others' behaviors. In other words, they must be assumed to be legitimate. Second, the person being ordered has to believe that the authority will accept the responsibility for the consequences. This experiment sparked a massive uproar at the time, as people could not believe that a normal, innocent person would hurt another innocent person. In a social environment, we see the same concept being presented, not to the same extremes of electrical shocks, of course, but rather by simply cutting pay in lower levels of a company, or simply ordered to lie about other people's whereabouts because a higher up needed to cover their own mistakes. With that being said, I would love to hear what you think of this topic. Do you think obedience is something that you would avoid, or perhaps you do take responsibility for every action you take? Tell me what you think. I would love to hear it up in the comment section. And with that, I end my video. I hope you have enjoyed watching it, and I will see you all later.